In the early morning hours of June 25, 1950, South Korean villagers woke to the sounds of artillery explosions and 90,000 North Korean troops crossing the 38th parallel.
Mr. President, the United Nations finds itself confronted today with the gravest crisis in its existence. 48 hours ago, the Security Council, in an emergency session, determined that the armed invasion of the Republic of Korea by armed forces from Northern Korea constituted a breach of the peace. Accordingly, the Security Council called for a cessation of hostilities forthwith and the withdrawal of the Northern Korean authorities of their armed forces to the 38th parallel.
2 days later, on June 27, 1950, President Harry S. Truman proclaimed a national emergency, declaring, "The increasing menace of the forces of communist aggression requires that the national defense of the United States be strengthened as speedily as possible."
On Sunday, June 25th, Communist forces attacked the Republic of Korea. This attack has made it clear beyond all doubt that the international communist movement is willing to use armed invasion to conquer independent nations. An act of aggression such as this, it creates a very real danger to the security of all free nations. The communist invasion was launched in great force with planes, tanks, and artillery. The size of the attack and the speed with which it was followed up make it perfectly plain that it had been plotted long in advance. 52 of the 59 countries which are members of the United Nations have given their support to the action taken by the Security Council to restore peace in Korea. Under the flag of the United Nations, a unified command has been established for all forces of the members of the United Nations fighting in Korea. General Douglas MacArthur is the commander of this combined force.
Barely 5 years after the end of World War II, America was at war again. Once again, through newsreels, newspapers, and magazines, the American public soon learned the names of faraway places in a distant country. The 38th parallel, Seoul, Incheon, Osan, Heartbreak Ridge, and the Chosin Reservoir all became a part of the daily American conversation. Led by the United Nations Command, South Korea and the United States, allies quickly joined the fight, each contributing in their own way. Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom combined to contribute almost 58,000 troops. Luxembourg provided 44 troops, and 5 additional countries provided humanitarian aid. By September 2, 1950, 22 nations had amassed a combat force of over 180,000 troops, including tens of thousands of Americans. The first U.S. troops landed at the Busan airport on July 1, 1950, and quickly saw action 4 days later at the Battle of Osan, the first battle between the North Koreans and the United States. 540 troops were sent to Osan to help slow the advance of the North Korean army while more U.S. forces arrived. On July 5th, the American troops engaged a force of over 5,000 North Koreans and 36 tanks. Badly outnumbered, the American troops withdrew from the battlefield with about 130 killed or missing in action. The month-long Battle of the Busan Perimeter began on August 4, 1950, and ended on September 16, 1950. In one of the first major battles of the war, the 140,000-man-strong UN command made a final stand along a 140-mile battlefront. Fighting against an enemy force of 98,000, the UN forces were able to stop the tide of the North Korean invasion, and for the first time, the North Koreans were forced to retreat.
At Busan, the UN forces had to stand firm or be pushed off the Korean peninsula. They stood firm.
As the UN forces battled along the Busan perimeter, A surprise amphibious landing took place on the morning of September 15, 1950, in the lightly defended enemy-held Incheon.
Behind the defending ring of troops, reinforcements were pouring into the port of Busan. Soldiers from many lands who had traveled thousands of miles to fight for the right of a distant nation to remain free.
Over 75,000 troops and 261 naval vessels took part in the invasion force, and by September 1950, Incheon was back in Allied control.
U.S. Marines made an amphibious landing 150 miles behind the enemy lines at Incheon. The landing cut off the enemy from his supplies and caught him in a giant United Nations pincers.
By September 25, 1950, the 40,000 UN forces under the command of General MacArthur were entering the heavily fortified outskirts of Seoul.
Exactly 3 months to the day after the city of Seoul fell to the communist invaders, UN forces recapture this South Korean capital. These are Marines and U.S. 7th Division troops advancing into Seoul under enemy fire. Street fighting rages throughout the city. The Reds have fortified many of the buildings, and Red tanks may appear around any corner.
After a 5-day battle for Seoul, General MacArthur announces the city's recapture on 26 September. There's still fighting in the city, but the main communist garrison is fleeing to the north. UN troops rest as they close another chapter. After major victories at Incheon and Seoul, the UN forces continued to rapidly push north into North Korea. On November 17, 1950, a communist Chinese force of an estimated 120,000 troops surprised the 30,000-strong UN command forces at the Chosin Reservoir. Under the most brutal conditions, 36 degrees below zero, mountainous terrain with equipment that would not work under the bitter cold, the UN forces were surrounded. After a 17-day battle, the UN forces were able to escape and fight a running battle back to the Hungnam airport. The UN forces paid a heavy cost. Over 1,000 troops were killed in action, 4,500 plus were wounded, and over 4,000 missing. Estimates place the Chinese losses at over 45,000 total casualties. After the North Korean army withdrew from the Battle of Bloody Ridge, they reformed a defensive line about 1,500 yards away on what became known as Heartbreak Ridge. From September 13th to October 15th, 1951, UN forces and North Korean forces attacked and counterattacked. Day after day, the UN forces would mount an offensive attack up the ridgeline, briefly hold the line, and be pushed back by a vicious counterattack. Entire units were wiped out. On October 11th, the UN forces launched a massive armored attack utilizing more than 30 tanks, aircraft, and artillery to break the North's supply line. After 30 days of fighting, the UN forces were able to secure the ridge. As the Armistice talks dragged on throughout 1952 and early 1953, the UN and the Communist forces traded battle lines with neither force able to make significant advances. If they did advance, territory gained one day would be lost the next. Battles were fought over hills that looked just like the hill from yesterday and the week before. All through July 1953, rumors ran rampant that peace was at hand. And then on July 27, 1953, the news broke.
In Korea, 3 years of combat end as United Nations and Communist negotiators at Panmunjom sign a truce. The long war, undertaken to stop Red aggression, is over. The enemy holds less territory than before his troops marched, but the cost has been bitter for both sides. With fighting ended, a political conference is slated to deal with the touchy problem of unifying Korea and assuring peace. Neutral observers are already present to oversee adherence to armistice terms.
The bulky agreement spells out in minute detail every provision of the truce, and the actual signing is a complicated affair. Each delegate present must sign his name 9 times, and each delegation has 5 members. The ceasefire is good news to the men on the front. At Woosan Base Camp, just behind enemy lines, Supreme Commander Mark Clark affixes his signature, and the armistice becomes official and the fighting is over. Prisoners will be exchanged, but there is little rejoicing. The Cold War is on, and the world wonders what's next.
We have won an armistice on a single battleground, not peace in the world. We may not now relax our guard nor cease our quest. Throughout the coming months, during the period of prisoner screening and exchange, and during the possibly longer period of the political conference which looks toward the unification of Korea, we and our United Nation allies must be vigilant against the possibility of untoward developments.
By the time the Korean War Armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, over 1.7 million Americans had served in the Korean War theater. Over 33,000 had been killed in action, and 133 Medals of Honor were awarded, 95 posthumously. To date, there has not been a formal peace agreement to end the war, and 45 years later, the USA still has over 28,000 troops that stand at the ready in South Korea.
We shall fervently strive to ensure that this armistice will, in fact, bring free peoples one step nearer to their goal of a world at peace.